Good morning and happy Saturday. Welcome to GSPA's second virtual conference. I'm Barry Bryant, your current treasurer, and I'm thrilled to kick off today's event. Our theme is all about bringing back the incredible discussions we experienced at the HSPA conference in Louisville. And today we've lined up an amazing roster of speakers who will share their expertise and fresh perspectives. But before we dive in, let's take a quick commercial break. Then my co-host, Wesley Luke, the GSPA Director of Community Affairs, will introduce our first of four speakers. Stay tuned, it's going to be an inspiring day.
Be the change.
Be the change.
Be the change.
That's right.
Be the change.
Be the change you want to see.
Hi, Barry and Luke.
Hello.
Good morning.
I was actually expecting a couple more commercials there, but we're going to go on with the speakers. We got Adam Okada here lined up with us with HealthMark. He has 18 years of experience in sterile processing. He's worked in every position in sterile processing, from setting up the case carts to managing to educator. He is currently the educator with HealthMark company, where he works with webinars, hybrid events, and educational videos. So let's welcome Adam Okada.
All right. Thank you, Wesley. Appreciate it. And thank you, everybody, for joining today. Really appreciate you coming out on a Saturday morning. I know it's not easy to get up and do sterile processing education, but it's really all about patients and trying to improve our patient safety. And that's why it's all here. And I'm excited to hear some of the presentations later on. Dr. Nozari, Leslie, and George as well, George and Eddie. So I'm very excited to see the presentations today. So this presentation, just so you know, came about because I was doing what we call a focused assessment. I was going out and I was looking at their insulation testing. And at this particular facility, I was watching a technician. He was doing a laparoscopic set. So I was there looking for insulation testing. So I went over and I was observing him as he was putting a set together. And I noticed that it was a take apart set. He was putting the instruments together, and then he was putting them in the tray, put indicators in, and then he closed the lid. So there was no insulation testing going on at all. So I started talking to him. I just kind of wanted to understand what the process was. Was there an insulation tester? It was there. There was one of them. It was sitting over on the other side of the room. But he wasn't doing the testing, and I just kind of wanted to understand why. So as I was talking to him, he had been a traveler for about 12 years. He had been in sterile processing about 20. He knew all the standards. He was reciting the standards back to me. So he really knew his stuff and was very knowledgeable. But I was trying to figure out, as I was talking to him, why he wasn't doing the insulation testing. And eventually I did get him to open up a little bit. And what he told me was he was a traveler, and he was never rewarded as a traveler or got his contract renewed because he did all the steps of the process. He was rewarded because he went really fast. And the other part of it was his job description wasn't complete. So he had the job description was a lot of HR legalese, lift 25 pounds, all that kind of stuff. But the sterile processing tasks were really limited to cleaning and sterilization of surgical instruments. And so he said, as long as he did his job description, they really couldn't fire him as a traveler. Now, that's a little bit debatable and not ideal. And especially for the patient, if I was that patient on the table, I would not appreciate that sort of mindset. But I understood where he was coming from, in that he was all about job security. He had a family to support and things like that. But it really started me thinking about sterile processing, how we view ourselves and how we view the industry as a whole. And so that's where this presentation came from. We're going to look at some of the science and evolution of sterile processing. So let me get going here. Some disclosures to start out. So I am an employee of HealthMark, a Getting a company. No compensation's been received for the presentation. I'm going to have some opinions here, and those are going to be my own and not necessarily that of my employer. And this presentation is not intended to be used as a training guide or promotion. Before you use any medical device, look at the IFU. So This is from something called The Hero's Journey. A hero starts out in their ordinary world, and the ordinary world is fairly mundane. It might be a little bit boring. It's kind of the same old thing they're used to. Um, then something happens, and the hero has to go out into this unknown world. Along the way, they're going to meet a mentor, they're going to have allies, they're going to have obstacles and things thrown in their path. And at some point during the story, things are going to get dark, and the hero is going to be challenged in a way they've never been challenged before, and they want to maybe give up the fight. And at the end, evil is vanquished, the hero is victorious, and then the world itself is changed, and the hero will return back to their ordinary world a fundamentally changed person. So this is from something called that Joseph Campbell wrote called The Hero with a Thousand Faces in 1949. And it's something called The Hero's Journey. And the book was really about like comparative mythology, looking at mythology stories and stories that we've told, and really stories from cave paintings to cavemen sitting around a fire and telling stories to mythology, and then up into our modern day stories, the TV shows and the movies that we watch today. We all follow, or they all follow the hero's journey very closely. And what's sort of interesting about the hero's journey is that, take a movie like Lord of the Rings. Lord of the Rings is a very common movie that's associated with, or book that's associated with the hero's journey. Same thing for The Matrix. If you think about what The Matrix is, it follows that story very closely. Legally Blonde is another one that a lot of people talk about with the hero's journey. And then even if you go classic movies, Wizard of Oz, there's a lot of different examples of the hero's journey. But I'm sure a lot of people are out there like, what did I sign into to this morning? This is a dragon on the screen and he's talking about storytelling, but I'm gonna try to bring it back around by the end and tie it into sterile processing. But I just kind of wanted you to understand that these story structures have a narrative structure that's very universal, and we're going to try to bring that back around by the end here. So some objectives for today: we want to describe the history of sterile processing and the way we've been viewed in the past. We're going to get into the way our profession has changed over the last 75 years, and then explain the direction of our industry and how we'll need to be viewed in the future. So let's start out with a brief history of devices here. We're going to start out in the 1950s, move up into the 60s, 70s, 80s, and then all the way up into today. So the 1950s, a lot of general dissection sets, stainless steel. These instruments had a long life. They were primarily 1 to 2 pieces, handheld retractors, clamps, and forceps that had 2 pieces that kind of moved back and forth, but they were relatively simple in their design. And then for us, it was a little bit easier for us to be able to clean, inspect, and process them. Whereas now, of course, we have a lot more complex instrumentation. But back then, this is where we got this glorified dishwashers. You may have heard that terminology. I hate it. I apologize that I have to use it as an example. But back then in the 1950s, we didn't have PPE. People used bare hands, or sometimes they used like kitchen gloves as they were washing things. They just sprayed the dirty stuff on the instruments off with a power sprayer and just kind of blasted all of that debris into the air. But this is where that terminology came from back in the 1950s. If we look in 1959, the first flexible endoscope was introduced, and the doctor would have to look down the eyepiece and then look towards the other end of the lens down the person. And the first flexible endoscope was introduced, but you can see there it's a relatively simple construction compared to what we have today. The 60s and 70s, we see low temperature sterilization being introduced. So this is an old ETO machine. And around the 80s, 90s, that's when we started to see hydrogen peroxide come on the market as well. Take-aparts entered the market in the late 1970s. So they finally started to realize, hey, these complex instruments that we're making, sterile processing can't clean them because there's all these kind of internal components that we can't see and that we can't clean. So they said, okay, well, maybe we need to look at take-aparts. So they started doing that in the late 70s, and then into the 1980s up until today, it's been rapid advancement. So we have a lot more complex devices, electronic equipment, titanium, polymers, plastics, robotics, all kinds of fun stuff in sterile processing. And there's a lot more oversight in sterile processing over the last 20, 30 years. So Joint Commission, a lot of people don't realize that they did not start doing unannounced surveys until 2006. So that was when unannounced surveys, and I remember those early surveys, they were not as comprehensive as they are today. Today, sterile processing is really a focus of Joint Commission. Oftentimes, sterile processing and endoscopy are the first 2 places that Joint Commission wants to go on that first day they show up, because they know they're probably going to have some findings with infection control in those areas. So why they made these changes, really it was for the patients and for the surgeons, because minimally invasive surgery was becoming more prevalent. It was better for patients, shorter hospital stays. They were able to go home without as much pain. So it was really good for patients, not so great for SPD, because in sterile processing, we know that we have these complex devices, these design challenges with these instruments, and reprocessing is oftentimes not the priority. So a instrument manufacturer might make an instrument for a specific procedure, for a specific usage. And then later on in the process, they'll be like, oh yeah, we have to reprocess this thing. How are we going to do that? So reprocessing is oftentimes not a priority. So it's kind of the last thing they think about in that design process. And then all these complex devices that came on the market, robotics and cameras and flexible scopes and all these kinds of things, when they came into sterile processing, it's not like they said, okay, let's double the staffing in SPD to accommodate all these complex devices. We have the same staffing and probably have for the last 15, 20, 30 years, the exact same number of staff. So we had all these extra steps in the process, all these complex devices that need to be inspected and things like that. But they didn't do anything to help us. They just sort of dumped it all on us. And then we all had to try to figure out. So if you ever are in your department and it feels chaotic and it feels like, how are we going to get all these things done? Why are they having robotic turnovers and it takes 3 hours to turn these things over? It's probably because they just didn't think of how long these things were going to take and the increasing complexity of them. So it brings us to the way we've always done things. And you're going to hear that terminology a lot, unfortunately, in sterile processing. A lot of departments are kind of stuck in the way they used to do things the old days when it was a little bit easier and more simple. And then we just never updated things. Just like I was talking about earlier on with that job description, that, clean and sterilized surgical instruments. It was literally like one sentence for the job description. Everything else was lift 25 pounds and all that kind of stuff. That's kind of what I'm talking about with the way we've always done things. But let's examine how that's going. So let's see how the way we've always done things is working out for us. So in 2015, the CDC estimated 110,800 surgical site infections. Now it's estimated because they don't know the actual number. They can only tell you what's been reported and what is estimated based on the information that they have available, because hospitals usually are pretty good about reporting these things, but they're not always the best about reporting their own surgical site infections. It was tougher to find numbers through COVID because, again, global pandemic, there was other priorities going on, but the Science Daily website estimated 180,000 to 300,000 surgical site infections. And then the CDC kind of verified that number, and they said from 2015 to 2021, they saw a 3% increase in surgical site infections. And that was from their own website on an article from January 2023. So if we take those numbers, assuming that 3% increase is accurate from the CDC, this is where we were in 2015. Here's 2021. And here's where we would be in 2027 if we continued on that path. We would be closing in on 500,000 surgical site infections, which 500,000 surgical site infections is kind of a terrifying number, because if you think about 3% increase, it seems like a small number. But if 2 to 3% of cases in 2015 were surgical site infections, a 3% increase would mean it's like 5 to 6%. Now you're getting up to 8 to 9% in 2027. That's almost 10% of cases that are having a surgical site infection. That's terrifying. And keep in mind that surgical site infections, if they're caught early enough and somebody gets antibiotics, they might be able to kick that infection. They might be able to beat it if they're not immunocompromised or something else has happened. So really, we're only seeing the ones that are having serious complications from their surgical site infections. So something is going on in the industry with surgical site infections. And I always hear people say, well, we've never had a surgical site infection at my hospital. My hospital doesn't have any. We've had 0 surgical site infections. We were at 300,000 a couple years ago. So either there's 300,000 at like a couple of bad facilities that have like 50,000 surgical site infections, or maybe you've had surgical site infections at your hospital and you just didn't realize it because the patient came back to the hospital and had an infection. The hospital treated it. Then the patient maybe sued the hospital. Then there was some kind of HR legal issue that got involved where they had a non-disclosure agreement with the patient. So a lot of these things we never even hear about. So there's a lot of surgical site infections happening that we don't know about at our facilities. Now, IP is probably more in the loop on those things, but in sterile processing, unfortunately, we don't get a lot of that stuff. From the World Health Organization, they said that heart attack and stroke is the #1 cause of death in the world. Cancer is #2. But if you look at the bottom there, having a major surgery is the 3rd leading cause of death in the world. So the way we've always done things just isn't working. That bar graph is going in the wrong direction. We really need to figure out a way to lower the number of surgical site infections that we're having. And I love this from despair.com tradition. Just because you've always done it that way doesn't mean it's not incredibly stupid. We have to think about what we're doing and then say, maybe we need to look at this differently in sterile processing. Maybe productivity isn't the most important thing. Maybe we have to figure out, case volumes have been going up for years and years because they know the more cases they do, the more money the hospital gets, the more money the surgeon gets. Believe me, I don't know. They play a lot of golf and those resort fees aren't cheap. So they got to make as much money as they can. So they keep increasing these case volumes, trying to do as many cases as possible. I had an endo doctor once who would just hop from room to room to room and would get through like 30 endo cases in a day. And I really started to question, like, what is the quality level of these scopes that are being processed? What is the quality level of the care the patient's really getting? If the doctor's just hopping from room to room and doing all these procedures, how much care and attention is each individual person getting? So I wanted to reevaluate this glorified dishwasher title that we've gotten and think about us in a different kind of way, because the C-suite, this is really honestly probably how they see us. They see entry-level positions. EVS, cafeteria, and sterile processing are usually the 3 entry-level positions into a hospital that don't require a college degree. And they think of them as kind of a low skill, low tech kind of a job. But it's not that way anymore. I really think that we need to look at ourselves more like detectives. So what a detective does is they find evidence, they look for proof, and then they try to give that evidence or proof as a end result. So for us, we're going to try to examine our instruments, inspect our instruments to see if they're actually clean and safe to use on patients. So I really think this is a closer correlation than that old glorified dishwasher title. And this is from Oprah Winfrey. Don't be confused between what people say you are and who you know you are. Everybody that's listening right now, if you're familiar with sterile processing, or even if you're an IP or somebody that's sort of a satellite area for sterile processing, you know how technical and scientific the work we do is. It takes so much training and so much knowledge to do sterile processing effectively. We can't let this outside influence of what the C-suite thinks, or maybe what the OR thinks of us, that this is a low skilled job or an entry-level position. We know better. And so we have to be the ones to try to change the industry perception of what people think of us. So my mom always wanted me to be a lawyer. So I'm going to try to make the case here for how we've evolved. I let her down. I went into sterile processing, obviously a much more lucrative career. So I'm going to make the case for how we've evolved in the last 20, 30, 40 years here. So if we look at point of use treatment, when I started 20 years ago, was very minimal. It was they would like soak things in water and send it down in a basin. Sometimes they would be cleaning at the point of use. Sometimes they wouldn't even send it down in the basin. It would just be bloody instruments in a bucket. But point of use treatment was very hit and miss. We had great OR techs, and sometimes we know this, sometimes the OR techs are in a hurry, just like us. They just want to skip steps and get to the next case because cases mean money. There's a lot of science that goes into pre-treatment or point of use treatment. So we know now that saline will break down that passivation layer. Hopefully we know a lot more about that passivation layer, that even if you soak it in water, that even that water soak can break down the passivation layer over time. And then of course, if we leave instruments dirty or bloody or soiled, that's also going to break down the passivation layer. The chemistries of pre-treatment. So we have pre-spray enzymatics. We even have non-enzymatics now for things like TAS and for eye instruments. And then packages that will maintain the humidity. We can understand now that keeping those instruments moist is going to be able to remove it easier in decontamination. And if there's biofilm starting to form, that's going to be almost impossible to get off in the manual cleaning process. So we really have to keep these things in a way that they're going to be able to be reprocessed. So biofilms we know can start forming in under 20 minutes. There's a great webinar on the HealthMark Academy, which is our brand new education site. So I would encourage everybody to go check it out. It was our February webinar with Mark Hodgson, and he was talking about biofilms and how there's so much interesting information about biofilms. So he was talking about how they can like inactivate themselves in the presence of a disinfectant. So it'll seem like it's been killed and it'll just stay there under the surface. And then once the disinfectant isn't there anymore, it'll actually reactivate. Those biofilms will reactivate, and then it can start growing and reproducing again. And there's a terrifying fact in there. If you really want to get scared, it was from a hospital, I think it was in Australia, where they were tearing the hospital down and they were going to build a new one. And as they were tearing it down, they did a study where they examined like all the bed pulls and all the curtains and all the door handles and everything in the hospital. They just tested, and it had biofilm on everything. Literally everything in the hospital had some form of biofilm on it. It's really scary if you want to go check that webinar out. But biofilm is just really prevalent, and we have to really take it seriously. And that's where point of use treatment really becomes important. Decontamination's changed a lot in the last 20 years. So the brushes that we use, typically in hospitals, I see the same two types of brushes. You have your toothbrush style, and you have your channel brush or your lumen cleaning brush. And those are the only two brushes that I see in a lot of sterile processing departments. But we have complex instrumentation. So we have things like shavers. And at the HSPA conference this year, there was a big focus on shaver cleaning. Corey Ofsted had a study. Our own Sharon Rojo from HealthMark also had a study that was presented. And shavers are virtually impossible to clean unless you have the right equipment. And sometimes they require multiple cleanings. Like that first cleaning oftentimes doesn't get everything clean. So there was a big focus at the conference on the arthroscopic shavers. And there are specialty brushes. You can see there's a shaver brush on the screen, specifically in that fork drive area. So if you think about the shaver and it's got kind of a long lumen, and then there's a fork drive at this end that's kind of poking out like this, and you have the lumen here. The brushes, your channel brushes, are going to clean around this area. Same thing with the toothbrushes. They'll just clean this side, but nothing is going to be able to clean that fork drive. And that's where you need a specialty brush to really get into those areas. Magnification in the decontamination area is really important. Our naked eye can see some things, but it's not going to catch everything. And that's where magnification comes into play. We really need that lighted magnification to help illuminate things that we're not able to see with the naked eye. And then we're seeing more and more borescopes. And I really want to encourage this in decontamination, especially, that we really need to start using borescopes, because in the old day, there was a great quote from Sharon Green Golden. A few years ago, she was the keynote speaker at HSPA, and she had this great quote where she said, in the old days, you used to brush through the suction, and then you would send it over to the clean side and say the magic words, Hakuna Matata, and you just hope for the best. And I love that quote. It always stuck with me because we have the tools now to be able to see those things we couldn't previously see. We just sort of crossed our fingers and hoped that suction was clean on the other side. But we have tools available, technology, that we can actually see those things now. In decontamination, I think there really should be a college degree for sterile processing, not necessarily that it's mandatory for somebody to be have a college degree to work in SPD, but I think it should be an option for sterile processing. There's so much that goes into our industry, the science of detergents and how surfactants work, and what's the difference between a detergent and an enzymatic. A lot of technicians don't know the difference between those things. Disinfectants are only effective if you have wet contact time. So one common disinfectant I see quite a bit is alcohol. And what people do is they take their instrumentation, they spray it with alcohol, and then they pass it over to the clean side. Well, the problem with that is that you need 5 minutes of wet contact time with alcohol in order for it to be an effective disinfectant. And I don't know if you've worked with alcohol before, but it dries very quickly. That thing would be dry in maybe 20 seconds. So that's not the wet contact time. We're not actually killing the microorganisms we think we are. And that's where we get a lot of this chemistry misunderstanding in SPD. We just spray it on there and assume everything's going to be fine. Or we do that PDI wipe and we think that's going to be effective. Those also require 2 minutes of contact time as well. Water quality, if we were talking about sterile processing as a college course, water quality would have to be either a semester or maybe even a full year of content, because there's so much that goes into water quality, understanding the reverse osmosis or deionized water, the treated water, the changes that we've had in the industry, the ST 108 that just came out. There's so much that's there as well. pH can affect your water, the hardness. And I've kind of done a little bit of digging into the hospitals that are in the news. So whenever I see a hospital, oh, so and so got shut down by the state, they stopped surgeries at this facility because SPD was having issues. I've been looking into this a little more closely, and almost every single one has issues with water quality. It's really a thing that can get you shut down. So you might be doing processes, you might be following IFUs, and everything is looking great. But if you're having problems with your water and that water is, infecting patients, we've seen waterborne pathogens coming out of AERs. So there's a lot of knowledge and science that goes into water quality that we really need to understand to be able to do this effectively. And then our equipment, and how do we know if our equipment is working? So we do our manual cleaning at the sink. Hopefully we're doing an effective job. But once it goes over to the machines, we sort of just put it in, start, and forget it. And we don't really look at whether or not our equipment's working. I've seen so many washers that had spray arms that didn't spin. They were just static and staying in one place. Ultrasonic, when you close the lid on your ultrasonic and you press start, you hear it humming and you assume that it's working. So how do we really know that our equipment's working the way it should? Soil removal tests are great for your washers, your ultrasonics, and some of your cart washers, if they have an instrument cleaning cycle, do also require soil removal testing. This is pretty standard in the industry. You can see the TOSI test there on the screen. There's a lot of people that are doing soil removal testing. But what we don't see as often is cavitation testing. So ultrasonics use transducers. Those transducers are what's providing the ultrasonic or cavitation action. And then there are tests that are specifically testing for cavitation. A lot of people don't know that your soil removal test, if you just place it in the center of the tank, it can pass, but you could have dead spots in your ultrasonic where there's no cavitation happening. So having a test that's actually looking at cavitation specifically. And then your lumen flushing is another function that people are often not testing. We hook up laparoscopics, robotics, all kinds of instruments to our lumen flushing function, but we're not testing the lumen flushing function. So you could have a kinked hose, it could be separated, it could have a broken O-ring. Those pumps that supply water to the lumen flushing are often a separate mechanism. And we had a hospital that we went into, and one of the pumps was turned off. So all of the flushing on one side of the ultrasonic wasn't happening. And there's no way you would be able to know that unless you had a test to test for that lumen flushing functionality. And then cleaning verification, we're seeing more and more in the industry. Now we're getting into more like a laboratory setting, right? We're actually doing this testing on our instruments to see if it's clean. And patients, if they knew that we had cleaning verification testing available to us and we were not performing it when there was a question, they would be horrified and furious with us, because we have this technology, it's relatively inexpensive, and yet we still don't use it. And now we're getting into microbial surveillance. And you could see that in ST108, where they want you to do microbial surveillance on your water lines, going in and out of your AERs to make sure that you don't have any microbes living inside your water pipes. But really getting into that almost like laboratory type of science there. And why do we need cleaning verification? It's really because of a game that we all play in sterile processing, and you know the game because you've played it or somebody has played it with you, and you take an instrument and it doesn't look quite right, and you show it to somebody and you say, hey, is this blood or rust? And blood or rust is the game we play in SPD all the time, unfortunately, because something's discolored, it has a stain, we can't identify it. We just look at it and be like, I wonder if that is blood or rust. The reason we play that game is because it can be almost impossible to tell the difference. If you look here at the screen, at 100 micrograms, blood looks like blood. It's kind of pooled up there. You can see that dark red, kind of reddish brown tint to the blood. But at 10 micrograms, now it starts to look like a little bit of a discoloration or a staining that's happening. 1 microgram is, barely visible, and then 0.1 is almost invisible to the naked eye. So it's very difficult to know, but 0.1 micrograms is still enough to cause an infection. So we really do need to take these things seriously. And the reason that blood or rust is not a funny game is because this instrument that we were looking at that was discolored, when we tested it, it actually did test positive for protein. So there was some kind of biological material in there. And that's the scary thing about blood or rust. If you're playing that game in your department and you have a lot of discolored instruments, you're having a problem usually with water quality, but it could be a problem where it's not cleaning effectively with your equipment or at the manual cleaning steps. So really start to look into if you have issues with staining, that is something that needs to be taken care of. Next up is prep and pack. And I don't like the terminology of prep and pack. I think that's the old mindset of a long time ago. I like the term inspection, assembly and inspection. That was my podcast co-host, Kevin Anderson, came up with that terminology. And he said, that's what this department is. You're actually assembling it, yes, but you're also inspecting these instruments. And that's what we should start to call it instead of prep and pack. But I get prep and pack's a little more catchy. But assembly and inspection is what I like to call this area. So there's functionality testing. I do see a lot of scissor testing material in departments as I'm going in and out. But beyond that, I'm not seeing a tremendous amount of functionality testing. For example, like the silicone or the dowel rods that you're supposed to test the osteotomes and chisels with, the note cards or index cards that you're supposed to punch keratins. Keratins are a big deal. If you think about what they're being used for, they're usually there to take a biopsy or a sample of tissue in the lamina, which is a very tough kind of tissue. And so those keratins need to be really sharp when they punch. They really need to be able to take a clean cut for that biopsy. And a lot of surgeons that I've had in the past have been furious with SPD because we didn't check them. So they would just be all gnarled and nasty. I know one surgeon would actually like manipulate bone with the keratins. It was constantly coming back all bent and out of shape. But that functionality testing of all of our instruments really, but is specifically with things like keratins and other types of instruments that are really critical care, we really need to be having more tests at our workstations to be able to do those things. Magnification in the prep area. A lot of people don't realize that in prep and in decontamination, robotic instruments require 4 times magnification. That's how you inspect it. There is no insulation test in the IFUs for the XI robotics. And so what they did instead is they said you have to use 4x magnification. Well, in sterile processing, we typically have these like swing arm type magnifiers that are on the workstations. Most of those swing arm magnifiers are 2 to 2.25 times magnification. So they're not meeting that requirement. And remember, it's in decontam too. So if you have a swing arm magnifier in decontam, usually that's not going to be 4x magnification there as well. But we need that better magnification. And what I think we really need to move towards is more digital magnification. So these microscopes that you can USB plug into your computer and see them on the screen can go up to say 270 times magnification. So they're going to be able to catch a lot of things that those swing arm magnifiers, the kind of old way of looking at it, aren't going to be able to see. And this is a robotic instrument, and you can see there up close and under magnification, there are a lot of issues with it. Now, when you looked at it with the naked eye, you know how small these areas are. We couldn't actually see any of this damage. But as soon as you put it under a magnifier, you can see there, and I'm going to try to like put my mouse on the screen, see if you guys can see it. But right here, there's something sticking out the side of this or sticking to the outside. Down here, there's a little piece of debris underneath this little pulley over here. And then all throughout, can you see guys see these little fibers? I don't know how good your screen quality is or with I'm sharing it, how good the quality is, but you can see all these little fibers on the screen, which is pretty obviously the blue towel lint. As those things were sitting on blue towels, they were picking up pieces of lint with those metal pulleys there. And all of those things, lint, by the way, Dr. Wava Truscott has a lot of great data and studies that she's done on lint and how it acts in the body. And what happens basically is if one of these fibers gets inside a patient, you might think, well, it's been sterilized, so it should be fine. No. The body sees this going into the body as a foreign object and will attack it. So then it's focusing on this piece of lint instead of focusing on the surgical wound. So that most of your issue is going to be there. And then also these things can start to clot. They can have issues with embolisms. So lint actually has caused a lot of issues for patients in their recovery times. And it's something we really need to take seriously. So if you're still using blue towels and SPD, I would encourage you to look at other options to try to avoid those things. There are things like sponges that you can use at the sink. You have liners that you can use instead of towels. Try to get rid of as much lint from your department as possible. So insulation testing, if you have damaged insulation, and we know this with, insulated LEAP instruments, if you have LEAP vaginal speculums, or if you have insulated bipolar forceps, laparoscopics are the obvious one, but insulation testing should be done. We've seen so many infections occurring from insulation and the burns associated with insulation. It really is a big deal. And just like that story I told earlier on, insulation testing is something we really need to be doing every single time. For scope functionality, I remember how we used to do this in the old days. We used to take a scope and turn it upside down so that the light post was facing the light. And then we'd look at it and see if we could see through it. And if we could see through it, then that was a good scope and it was good to go. But we actually have the technology to test these things. There's little handheld devices that you can hook the scope to and then actually see whether or not that scope is functional. And borescopes, again, on the clean side, are very, very important. The digital magnifiers are so cheap. So those digital magnifiers, the microscopes that I showed you on the previous screen, those are like $400 or $500. They should be on every workstation. There's really no excuse why they shouldn't be there because they're catching things that we can't see, and those swing arm magnifiers are really not good enough to be able to do what we need them to do. Borescopes, I can understand a little bit more because they are expensive. It can cost $7,000, $8,000 for a borescope to get in the department. But at the same time, the cost of a surgical site infection could be hundreds of thousands of dollars, millions of dollars in some cases. There was that case in Portland where somebody got a surgical site infection, which was, I think, $2 million settlement or something like that. So it's like borescopes are such a small investment into patient safety. And if they can prevent an infection, they've already paid for themselves, right? If they prevent one infection, then they've already paid for themselves. And then sterilization, so much science that goes into sterilization as well. If we look at the anatomy of our sterilizers, I'm a little embarrassed to admit this, but early on in my career, when I learned about the anatomy of a sterilizer and there's the jacket. The sterilizer has a jacket. And so I went behind the sterilizer and I saw that little silver insulation coating. And I said, oh, that's the jacket. It has a little coat that the sterilizer wears. No, that's not what the jacket is. So it's going to be a lot of anatomy that we have to understand how the sterilizer works, that the jacket fills with steam first, then it can go into the chamber and it's already kind of conditioned so that's not going to create condensation. There's a lot to go into that. We talked about water quality and how important that is, but in sterilization specifically, if you're having issues with wet packs, it is most likely going to be the wet to dry steam ratio that is thrown off. So I had this in one of my departments. It should be 97 to 98% dry saturated steam and 2 to 3% water. Now, if you throw that off, like in my department, we had 92 to 93% dry saturated steam and 7 to 8% water. So we were doing an hour of dry time and we're still coming out with wet packs because there was just so much condensation in the chamber that it wasn't able to be cleared out. So that wet to dry steam ratio, if you're having an hour of dry time, and I actually had a hospital that emailed us that had 90 minutes they were having of dry time for their sets and they were still coming out wet. And I said, it's the wet to dry steam ratio. It could be other things. You could have steam trap issues and other kinds of stuff, but it's more than likely issues with the wet to dry steam ratio. And then low temperature sterilization and all the science that goes into that, understanding how hydrogen peroxide kills by oxidation and essentially is destroying the molecules and making them unable to be reproducing so that's how it kills the microorganism. It doesn't actually, like, heat will destroy it in the steam sterilizer, but low temperature kills by like a toxic kind of process. So it's not going to get less complex in sterile processing. We have artificial intelligence that's coming fast. We can see it everywhere in our daily lives. AI is everywhere. It's all over our computers. It's all over everything that we're doing. And it's coming into sterile processing. But just like everything else, sterile processing has been very slow to adopt AI into the department. And I'm not really sure why. I think it's just part of our, well, we do it this way. We don't really need AI, that kind of thing. But if you think about a borescope, the borescope, the hardest thing that we have when we use a borescope is we're looking down at the borescope and we don't know what we're looking at. And so that's really the tough part of the borescope technology is it's great, but when I'm seeing something that's down a channel, I don't know, is that Is that a problem? Is that a discoloration? Is that just a shadow? We have all these questions and it takes so much time. So AI is really what's coming into play that can help us identify this. So this is something called Watchdog. I'm gonna go ahead and play this here. You can see as it's going down the channel, you can see all those little, what we call bleeps and bloops. It's actually identifying abnormalities or defects or things in the scope as it's passing through the channel. So it kind of takes a lot of the guesswork out about what is this? I don't know what it is. And because it's AI, it's constantly getting back about, it's getting, closer to, it's learning as it's going. Sorry. So the AI is really learning as it's going through. So the more times you put it down, the easier it's going to be to identify water. It's even able to identify simethicone and things like that now. So the AI is really there as a tool, but we've just been really slow to adopt this technology. So what's another profession that has evolved significantly in the last, 30, 40, 50, even the last 75 years? So there's been a lot of technologies that have changed professions, but one that I think is really significant and very similar to how we used to do things in SPD to how they are now is CSI. So in crime scene investigation, in the old days, they would draw chalk outlines around the body. The only kind of technical scientific work that they would do was they had that little fingerprint brush and they had the dust and they would dust on the surfaces and they would see if there was a fingerprint there. But it was very kind of low tech kind of stuff, but that's not the way CSI is anymore. It's a very high tech industry, and they've adopted a lot of science and a lot of technology into their roles as well, very similar to how we do in sterile processing. Unfortunately, they make TV shows about CSI where they do not about SPD, but I would watch that show if there was a show about SPD. So CSI or SPD, just like CSI technician, they have to use a lot of technology, but imagine you had a CSI tech that decided not to do blood typing on a blood sample, or the ballistics expert who didn't use or didn't examine a bullet under a microscope. I'm sort of a true crime nerd, so I watch all those kind of true crime documentary things. But that would be unacceptable, right? If they have a tool available, they should be using that tool to figure out what's going on. Just like we do with our borescopes and with our cleaning verification tests, we should be playing blood or rust. We have a test that can tell us whether or not it is blood or rust. So this is all the kind of stuff that I really think we need to kind of relook at our industry and how we look at ourselves and say, no, it's unacceptable that we don't do those kinds of things anymore. And just like they document their results and those documents can be used in a legal proceeding, we do need to understand our documentation is also a legal document. If a patient has an infection, that could be an issue, and they really need to, you really need to have your documentation in order when you're going through, because again, it is a legal document. So who are we in sterile processing? And this is not an existential question. I'm not asking you to ponder the meaning of life. I'm saying as a sterile processing industry, who are we and who do we want to be? So historically, what sterile processing has been is we've called ourselves sterile processing technicians. And what I'm proposing in this presentation is that I want to make a very small change to just one word change from technician. And I think we should be called sterile processing technologists. And I want to give you a little bit of my rationale why to do that. So a technician, if we look at the definition of it, is a person employed to look after technical equipment or do practical work in a laboratory. So a technician really is running the machines. They're kind of a machine expert. They're the ones who press start. They're the ones who troubleshoot if something goes wrong with the machine. But that's typically what we think of in the definition of a technician, what we've been for the last, 50, 75 years, whatever it is. A technologist, on the other hand, is an expert in a particular field of technology. That sounds more like what we're doing. And then I like this definition better. It's a person who uses scientific knowledge to solve practical problems. I really think that the technologist definition is much closer to what we're actually doing in SPD than what a technician does. Other professions that use this title, you can oftentimes see surgical technologists. The AST is the Association of the Surgical Technologists. So surg techs have done a great job of kind of rebranding themselves, getting out of surgical technicians and becoming technologists. So they're also experts in their particular field of technology, and they use scientific knowledge to solve practical problems. Now, a surg tech oftentimes doesn't have all the technical equipment that we have in SPD. Sometimes they have machines that they have to run or prep and do things like that. So they do need to be experts in their particular field. But there's a lot of technology and science that goes into sterile processing, but yet we haven't been adopting this kind of language. And then a laboratory technologist. So my parents were both laboratory technologists and worked in the hospital. And I always said, I'm never going to be like my parents. I'm never going to do what they do. And then I was doing this presentation. And I was like, oh man, I'm turning into my dad. Because I'm making the case that we were very similar to a laboratory technologist, experts in their particular field of technology, and they use scientific knowledge to solve practical problems as well. So if we examine how I'm turning into my father a little bit deeper, in a laboratory setting, they receive blood and body fluid samples and have to be trained in the proper handling. And then we also are receiving blood and body fluids from the OR and have to be trained on proper handling there. In the laboratory, they use scientific knowledge and training to test their equipment. If you go into a laboratory setting, you're going to see a lot of technology kind of everywhere, all over the department. And they have a lot of scientific knowledge and training to be able to run that equipment. And then we also use scientific knowledge and training to test our equipment, just like they do in a laboratory. They also use specialized equipment to test their samples. They have blood typing machines and all kinds of interesting equipment in the lab. And we have specialized equipment to process devices. So again, a very similar kind of position. And if I haven't convinced you yet that this change, very small change from technician to technologist is really needed in our industry, a technician on Indeed.com, average salary is $42,140. A technologist makes $63,518. And wouldn't everybody like to make $20,000 more per year? So hopefully that convinces you that this change is going to be needed in SPD. So where do we go from here? I think the first thing we need to do is change our job titles and job descriptions to reflect the complex work that we're doing. The C-suite is never going to change their mindset. They like us being an entry-level position. They like us being unskilled labor in sterile processing, and they're not going to change that because we ask them to. We have to take steps to really reflect the science and technology that goes into our jobs now. So we have to change our job titles, we have to change our job descriptions, and say, hey, we're supposed to be using borescopes and all these scientific tools, our technological tools, to be able to identify whether these things are clean, because the devices are more complex. So we've had to adapt and become more complex ourselves. Our training also has to reflect the science behind what we do. In sterile processing, typically what the training consists of is what's called do as I do training. Do as I do training is what they do in fast food. So you have a person, and the person is training another person. The trainee will watch the trainer do a task, and then the trainee will do that task. And if they do it effectively, then the trainer signs them off and says, okay, they know what they're doing because they just did that thing. So that's do as I do training. And it's not effective unless they understand why they're doing those things. So if they don't understand why enzymatic soaking takes a certain number of minutes based on whatever is on the bottle, they're just going to dunk them in the enzymatic and put them in the washer because they don't understand. They just think, oh, it needs enzymatic, it's got to go in the washer. So they'll just start skipping steps. And that's where we see this productivity pull come into play in sterile processing, because they don't know the why. So we need training that reflects the science behind all those things. Why do you need the soak and enzymatic? Why does it take a certain amount of time to break down the proteins? Why does the surfactant take a certain amount of time before you can brush it off with the brush? All those things are the things that should go into our training modules. Our workstations also have to reflect the science behind what we do. So if you go into a laboratory setting, it's just technology everywhere. There's machines and there's microscopes and there's test tubes and all kinds of sciencey stuff. So when the C-suite sees a laboratory, they're like, oh, this is a science. This is a place of technology. But in sterile processing, we're so slow to adapt this technology that's coming out that it's really difficult to show them how complex this job really is. And again, they're going to see it as dishwashers, because the dishwashers in the cafeteria, again, no disrespect to them, but because they're doing at a sink and we are cleaning at a sink, they see it very similarly. And so we have to change this mindset, and showing them borescopes and showing them microscopes and all these things on every workstation. That's how we kind of change their minds about what this is. And then go to your C-suite, reinforce the idea that this is a science and it needs to be taken seriously. We need more time to be able to do things. If you're going to bring in robotics to a hospital, you're going to need to increase staffing because you're adding 3 hours for every single robotic case that's coming in to the sterile processing workload. And 3 hours times 4 cases or 5 cases or whatever it is, that's adding how many hours of work to SPD, but you're not going to increase staffing. So now we're just going to rush through everything. So all these things are the things we have to reinforce to C-suite so that they understand what's happening here. And that's going to bring me back to the hero's journey. And the reason that the hero's journey is it's a story structure that works and that we all kind of understand on a intellectual level and an emotional level is because it's reflecting our journey. So the hero is in their ordinary world. Something doesn't feel right. And they feel like, oh man, something's got to change. I need to do something, or something's not right. There's an injustice that needs to be corrected. We see and we feel those things. And that's the reason we respond to the hero's journey. And just like those stories, we have obstacles and we have issues and we have all these things that are complicating our lives infinitely. So the hero's journey is reflective of our journey. And that's why we respond to this story structure so much. And the reason I really appreciate everybody being here today is because you are actually, as the hero right now, you're actually learning about something that's going to help your department or going to help the industry as a whole. And it's really about you taking action to try to do something to make things better for patients, because patients are getting infections more and more frequently. And it shouldn't be that way. We have the science, we have the technology to know what the right things to do now. And yet we're not doing them because this pull of productivity, because they're not increasing staffing enough. They're cutting staffing in a lot of cases. So I love this quote from The Lord of the Rings, and Frodo has the ring and he's went on this quest to try to destroy it because it's the source of great evil. And he says, he goes to the leader of the elves and he says, I know what I must do. I'm afraid to do it. And then Galadriel, who is the leader of the elves, looks at him and says, even the smallest person can change the course of the future. And what you're doing in sterile processing, when you test with that insulation tester, when you examine with a borescope, when you take that extra time to make sure your equipment is working, you are making sure a patient is safe. And you might be changing the course of the future because you're saving that patient's life potentially by doing the right things in SPD. And that's what we need to teach in our departments, that doing the right things and saving patients' lives is the only priority. It's the most important thing. So thank you guys for prioritizing education. Thank you guys for being here today. Here are my references for this presentation. And then I'm not sure if we have questions, but GSPA, if there are any questions, I'm happy to answer them.
Yeah, I'm sure there's questions out there, Adam. That was a great presentation. There were so many things in there I can relate. On top of me being director of community service, I am an instructor at a technical college. So when you said we should go with education, it is being addressed in our area, I know. And also I know in the Atlanta area, it's kind of a big thing that's popping up. It's following the same pattern
awesome.
As surgical technologists that in the past were people referred to as technicians also. So that was two great things I wholly agree with you with. And I think the C-suites are starting to get on board because compliance is a big issue, and they're seeing instead of just looking at, oh, people are doing a job or it's coming out right, they're looking at qualifications, job descriptions, and everything behind it. So also there's a lot of good.
It's awesome. Yeah.
But we'll take any questions if anybody has any questions for Adam. So yes, please type them in the chat if you have anything.
And you can always reach out to me on LinkedIn, or my email is aokada@hmark.com. If you ever want to email me, happy to answer any questions offline as well.
I wasn't able to get your bio in earlier. I had it to the side. I got it pulled up there. So I've got that little quick bio, a little history of Adam, if anybody.
Yeah, and I just put my email in the chat if anybody wants to talk to me offline.
Yes. Very good. If there's no questions, we'll move on to a commercial break, and we'll see a couple commercials from the Georgia SPA.
the change.
Be the change.
Be the change.
That's right.
Be the change.
Be the change you want to see.
Hey, welcome back from our break. Wesley Luke again. We're going to be introducing Dr. Attilio Nazari. He works with Solventum, as a senior medical science liaison, expert in AMI subject matter and national speaker. And I'm going to go ahead and probably add international. I know he's abroad right now. So if you all would like to welcome me, Dr. Nazari.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for the introduction. So while the slides are being loaded, so I'm glad to be here. It's an honor for me to meet the GSPA members virtually now, but hopefully soon in future, and also present alongside my great friends and experts from other organizations. Adam did a great presentation today, and I know Eddie, George, Leslie, and other also leaders from the chapter. They have great material for today, so I hope all of you enjoy. And so let's get started. What I'll be talking about is a cool factor innovation in the low temperature sterilization, and also it's kind of the theme of this meeting today, bringing the HSPA to the GSPA. So it's a presentation that also we had it in the HSPA this year. So all of you, welcome. There are some disclaimers here I would like to go, because some of them are important. What I will be talking about, is of course the current United States information. And we know that the standards, regulation, guidelines, they can change. We know that, in the standards, they get updated. New standards or new guidelines get published by different organizations. But it's important to always consult the product instruction for you. So IFUs are very important. Also, follow local laws and regulation. In many places around the world, local laws and regulation can override even the federal ones, even the state ones. Even a small town regulation or laws can override the state ones. So we know that. So it's very important that we follow our healthcare facilities procedures on that. And also, I am very active in the standards and guidelines around the world. And also, I'm a co-chair in EMI. I'm a convener in ISO. I'm a vice chair in SCC. And so basically, I'm involved in the Canadian standards, US standards, and global standards in ISO level. So that's why I want to highlight the standards are very important, but local laws and regulation can override everything. So that's very highlight I want to say from that. What I'll be discussing today is mainly in three parts. One of them, I want to talk about the current technologies, what are available for low temperature sterilization, and what are the publication and innovation we have. And in publication piece, as I said, I'm passionate about standards. So definitely I'll need to talk about standards a bit there. And also talking about the quality assurance practices for the low temperature sterilization. So what is an ideal sterilant? So in sterilization, what is doing the sterilization, basically the sterilant? And again, just what the sterilant is, it depends on modality. Again, I don't want to go details of what is a sterilant versus a sterilizing agent, but in general, what is doing the job for us, right? In steam, it's steam. In hydrogen peroxide, it's hydrogen peroxide. If it's ethanol oxide, it's ethanol oxide. If it's steam formaldehyde, it's both of them. So, and other modalities and other novel modalities that are being developed currently that we are speaking. So the attributes that we can, it's the list from the CDC as well. So we want to have high efficacy. You want to have good penetration, because when they can penetrate to the devices so they can sterilize them. We want to have material compatibility, that the material we have, they do not get destroyed by the process. We want to have rapid activity. The time is important. We know that time is really important, and we need to work with that around that. So we want to get rapid activity. We want it's non-toxic, because we are the one that working. We in the department, in the SPD and the CSSD department, we are the one working with those. We want to be safe for our staff and no toxic residues. And we want to make sure that it's organic material resistance there, adaptability of that, and we have monitoring capabilities for that, and effectiveness. And is it cost effective for us? Because it's also a cost. But another item is robustness, and this robustness is added to this list by CDC, by my friend, my colleague, Larry. So, and really we want to have a robust, and I think that's what maybe missed from the initial list that was being proposed. So ideally, or preferred method is steam, and that is also in the standards and guideline. So not only it's from the, for example, disinfection, sterilization,